I'm happy to present our next speaker. It's Dr. Gary Ann, and the title will be a NASEM-Compliant Critical Illness Digital Twin to Cure Sepsis. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks to Tom and James for the opportunity to speak to you all. Um, Several of you probably know me already as a very mild-mannered, non-provocative person, so you may be surprised by some of the content of this. For some background for people who don't know me, I'm a clinical clinician, a trauma critical care surgeon, and I've been doing computational biology for about 25 years. Um, and uh, and I got into this to solve a particular problem. As opposed to the very broad, expansive view that was presented by Dr. Chan, this is actually something that's relatively focused to a specific clinical question. So, in the interest of not being provocative, um, uh, oh, did this? Right. So, the, This has been alluded to previously, the term digital twin, as Reinhard mentioned, when we first started looking at this, it was a very uncertain, ill-defined term, and there are still multiple terms that are used in this particular space. And you can see what those lists are. There's this great paper from Wright from 2020 that talks about one of the differences between a model and a digital twin, and that abstract starts off very informatively with this quote from Through the Looking Glass. So, not to disparage any of these other things, because I do all these other things as well. They have very, very useful things. They are very important capabilities, many of which you've already seen. But why would I make a big deal about being NASEM compliant? Because it has to do with a specific thing that I want to do in terms of practicing as a clinician. So, is another example of semantic diffusion. Precision and personalized medicine mean things other than what those words mean in the English language. So we came up with this idea of true precision medicine that has these axioms, which some people have alluded to previously. The first one is that person A is not person B. That's obvious. But also importantly, the same patient with the same genotype and all that other stuff is not the same at different times in their disease course. And the goal of medicine is to treat. So we need to take care of patients, not just watch them. And this goes to the control aspects that Reinhard mentioned. And I think we want to be inclusive to not just have to be stuck with the things that we can currently do, but identify new things that we can do, particularly in terms of combinatorial. So if you want to be able to do all these sorts of things, if you are a clinician and you want to be able to really precisely personalize a particular therapy, then the concept of a digital twin is useful. So there are a couple things that limit our current ability to do these particular things. Um, and some of them have to do with limitations of our existing methods. So I've picked on this particular group for numerous times. This is an analysis of inflammatory subphenotypes in COVID-19 patients. And you can see when they do this analysis over time that you can get statistical differences between these particular groups, which is fine for overall aggregate characterization. But if you are wanting to take care of a particular patient, what you notice is that my patient's going to have a particular value, and these bars all overlap. So, to my knowledge, there's no statistical means of being able to distinguish which particular group you're going to be in um, from a particular measurement. And this is the key to the idea of wanting to twin, wanting to personalize to an individual patient, not necessarily generate a population. Again, that's very important, right? But you want to be able to have some idea about what your individual person is going to do. See, because all those things overlap. The other challenge of personalizing the real world data is the dirty secret of clinical data, which is number one, that if you're trying to do any sort of learning on clinical data, those patients are being treated, right? Those patients are under already some degree of control, and it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to parse treatment from the underlying biology, which means that if you're looking at clinical data, you can't actually represent the underlying biology because you can't separate how the biology would have been had you not done anything to it. This is important, right? Because we want to be able to steer the patient back to a state before they got ill. And if everything's under control and that's all you're looking at, there's no way to actually do that because you need that fundamental basis to be able to evaluate new things that you're going to do and how they interact. The other thing that is a challenge if you're trying to do ongoing forecasting with respect to patient trajectories, particularly in critical illness, there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens that you just cannot account for, right? These are intractable events that are unrelated to the underlying biology that's happened, but will definitely produce a biological signature. And then you're left with a bunch of, it's not actually noise, it's actually confounding factors that cannot be accounted for with respect to any biological representation, right? The issue here is if you are then going to rely on forecasting a patient trajectory, then if you say that you have to forecast with a particular prediction level, that's not going to be possible because you can't account for things in your model. So digital twins, however, can offer a path forward, and we've seen variants of this definition, which is currently embodied in the NASEM report we'll get to. But this is the original formal definition by Greaves in 2019, right? And the implications associated with that have been discussed in this particular conference already, culminating in this particular report, which I personally love. And I love because it gives a specific definition with specific criteria about specific capabilities that meet what the National Academies actually wants. And we'll get to the importance of that in a second, but having something that's compliant with this gives you capabilities that all those other very useful methods cannot provide. Right. So why would one need a NASEM compliant digital twin? So if you want a personalized treatment to an individual, to a particular person, you need that. So there's certain things that can personalize to an individual person. If you have a disease process that involves multiple treatments, meaning it's not just a surgical or interventional intervention that you have one change and then that's it, right? If there's an ongoing disease trajectory that would require potential manipulation of what you're going to do to that particular patient, which covers the vast majority of diseases, then you need to be able to account for the individual response dynamics over time, which is axiom number 2. And this is central. We're going to have to get back to this to a second. You need to be able to have some way to interrogate that system in a non-destructive fashion over time, so that you can update your digital twin, which is intrinsic to the NASEM definition, and means that these things are actually cyber-physical systems because it is impossible to disentangle the computational virtual representation from the means by which you acquire that data. So finally, you want to be able to go beyond optimizing existing therapies. You want to be able to combine things you already have in novel ways, or even try out new things. And that's number 4, axiom 4 of the true personalized medicine. So some selected focus points about how the NASEM report fits what I'm going to show you. This is the thing that Reinhard talked about that was very, very important for fit for purpose. So if you are interested in acquiring knowledge, well, then you want to be expansive. But if what you want to do is solve a particular problem, then you're necessarily going to have to kind of constrain what the requirements are of your virtual representation. There was a great deal of emphasis in NASEM report on VVUQ. All right. And, that was a backdoor way for them to try and bring up those issues with respect to AI, which unfortunately have not necessarily percolated through. But this is actually a critical aspect and intrinsic to how you are going to represent the population heterogeneity of which your individual is going to be part of. Control is part of what NASEM wants, the interaction between the virtual asset and the real world. Mentioned talking about being able to guide the data and sensor development, again, underappreciated in many digital twin projects. This ethics and data privacy and equity issues is a big thing, depending on what level of resolution you're going to have. There's a way around that, which I'm going to talk about, but the way that many people are thinking about digital twins inevitably entangles this particular component. And then finally, a system of systems of which it's going to be, because you have the computational model, you have the system that analyzes and controls the computational model, you have the system that interacts between that computational model and the real world asset. So the idea that you're going to have multiple integrated systems is intrinsic to the idea of a NASEM-compliant digital twin. And I'm going to give you an example of that. So this is the loop that Reinhardt showed. And then I'm going to show you the virtual representation that's included in this critical illness digital twin. The physical counterpart are patients in the ICU. The physical to virtual, we're going to talk about the virtual to physical is the control. We have this decision-making component, which is intrinsic to how you're going to implement that particular control. And then VVUQ is critical to being able to construct a virtual asset and be able to identify what you're going to do with that information. So, fit for purpose. What is the problem that we're trying to address with the critical illness digital twin? So the problem is sepsis, inflammation, critical illness, leading cause of death in the ICU. You can read this slide as well as I can. The main issue here is that it is an extraordinarily resource-heavy problem, and particularly those patients who linger in the ICU. So if we're going to get hit by a next pandemic, the ICUs are going to be overwhelmed by patients who cannot get rescued from the immune state that they have fallen into as a result of sepsis. Part of the reason we can't treat that, well, we can't treat this in any way other than organ support. We have no robust molecular interventions that can affect the underlying biology that drives sepsis. And then the question is, what is the time scale in our application space, which is hours or so, right, from a pragmatic standpoint. So this is where the fit for purpose comes into the design of what that iterative loop is between the physical and the virtual asset. So as I mentioned, this is what the treatment statement of sepsis currently is. This is inadequate because it's basically no different than what happened when I started practicing medicine 30 years ago or so. So why do you need an NASEM-compliant digital twin to address this particular problem? So we've talked about no effective therapies. One of the reasons that no clinical trial with immunomodulation has been demonstrated to be effective is because of the heterogeneity of the patient population and the level that they're being described, right? So the ability of state identification of these individual patients is suboptimal, to say the worst. The other component of this has been alluded to by other people who've talked about this. The immune system is very robust, has numerous parallel and redundant pathways that would require potential multimodal points of control. So this is essentially an adaptive control problem because the immune state changes over time. So you want to be able to have updatable sensing of the patient's state. This is a bidirectional data flow and multimodal interventions of control. So this requires the capabilities provided by NASEM-compliant digital twin because there's no other way to do it. So wrote this little paper, around the time that this initial cluster of things were coming about a schema for how you might be able to make a digital twin. And this is an example of applying that particular flow diagram to sepsis with all these particular fit for purposes, model types, etc. Turns out that matches nicely with the NASEM report, which preceded by a little bit. So a description of what the virtual asset is. This is a long-standing agent-based model of systemic inflammation and the initial immune response. It's 20 years old. It's as valid, not more valid now than it was when it was made because it's been produced things that otherwise weren't recognized at that time. So that's what it is. So this is the key component, right, which I'm going to get to at the end here, is that how do you establish trustworthiness in the virtual asset? So one of the things that we recognize in making these particular models, which anyone who's made mechanistic models will face, is How do you deal with the things you don't actually know? So that's actually a problem if you want to understand things, but there's a way to get around that if what your goal is to be able to control that particular system. So we have this idea of defining what the uncertainty that we care about is, having to do with the uncertainty associated with the model representation. And in order to avoid mistakes, we want to conserve that uncertainty as much as possible, right? And that's along the lines of the maximal entropy principle from statistical physics. Right, so the fit for purpose here relates to the validation component because the goal is robust control. Right. So we avoid bias in our particular model with this idea of dealing with perpetual epistemic incompleteness of any sort of computational model using the maximal entropy principle. You can read a little bit about right here, but the idea is that we want to have as comprehensive a representation of what could possibly be an explanatory reason for why you develop heterogeneity in a population, and then use that as your control space, as your control target for identifying what effective robust control is going to be. My colleague Chase Cottrell came up with this mathematical object, the model rule matrix, which is essentially a way of constructing a latent space of all the potential unrecognized connections that might be present in any fixed representation of a computational model. And the idea here is that you operate over that latent space, which you can't account for, but you need that wireframe diagram because that's the basis upon your control. This is an example about what happens when we use active learning to characterize what that latent space looks like by modifying the weights within that particular model. On the left, you see the base very sparse heat map of the connectivity of the base model. And then if we adjust and operate over the MRM to find and fit the heterogeneity of clinical data in terms of cytokine time series, it becomes much more rich, and a 3D representation is on the right. What this does, and this is related to the idea of synthetic data, is that what you accomplish is you greatly flesh out what the possible trajectory spaces might be to overcome the perpetual data sparsity associated with any sort of clinical data, particularly molecularly. So that's all the computational asset. That's a VVUQ, right? The question is, how do you connect that to the human, the real world asset? And this is where the integration between the representation of your virtual asset becomes important to be tied to your assay capability, because you want to be able to update your virtual asset with that information. So there is, by fortuity, a bedside cytokine multiplexed analysis kit to get you plasma levels that are represented in that particular model. There are other technologies that are potential in the future, and I think one of the points is that if you build virtual assets of a higher degree of resolution and you demonstrate that you need that higher degree of resolution, then you would have to interact with people who make these sensors to be able to get those sensors so that you can provide that connection. So what do you do with a virtual twin? Talked about the control. Our particular approach to use this, because our assumption is that over this particular control space, given the complexity, you can't use standard control modality investigation methods. So we use deep reinforcement learning, which is, for those of you who know, is related to game playing AIs. And we have done that for multiple cases. Here's one that's clinically relevant based on accessible mediators and intervenable molecular targets. This particular theoretical demonstration shows that you can take a 39% mortality cohort and reduce this mortality to 10%. It is a continuous adaptive control problem because it requires manipulating those 6 mediators listed in variable levels and variable directions at variable times. But this policy, because we train over that entire possibility space, is very much robust, as you can see in this slide below, in this figure below. Here's some examples of what the variation of activities could be. On the panel on the left, you see what the actions that are done by the AI over time. And on the right, you can see that the same policy, meaning that given a particular state of the system, you will apply a particular cytokine cocktail, you may be doing the same sort of thing, but it occurs at different times because the patients are heterogeneous. Again, this is all consistent with the problem that requires you to have the ongoing updatable component that the NASEM-compliant digital twin has. So it all works in theory. How do you actually get this to the bedside? Well, one thing you need to do is you want to show that this particular system can improve a sufficiently complex in vivo experiment of clinical sepsis, right? So you have this virtual offline training that constructs your virtual asset, and then a necessary real world evaluation, as you would have for any device, right, or therapeutic modality, so that you can actually see to have the preclinical testing to demonstrate that it's effective. This is where we're at right now. We are at the stage where we want to be able to do this real world evaluation. So what is the future work for the critical illness digital twin, as I alluded to? What would it take to be able to test this in patients? This is the sufficiently complex large animal ICU model that extends beyond 3 days, which has been an intractable problem in the past because of money. You can see how much this actually is expensive. Note here that the species differences between humans and pigs or apes or whatever are not necessarily relevant. What you want to actually do for the proof of concept is to show that a simulation-based AI reinforcement control updatable digital twin application can control this particular disease state. But you have to do this, right? If you're going to try and address sepsis, you're going to have to do this particular thing, because what this vision embodies is trends that have been attacked at a very piecemeal level. So people recognize that there's heterogeneity. People recognize that there is some sort of state response partitioning that is required, but it's all very, very limited. And our argument is that the heterogeneity of the disease process is such that any sort of low-hanging fruit attempt to try and do this is going to not be successful. And the idea is that you provide, this is what this is intended to provide, what you would need to do, and then it kind of jumps at the end about what is actually required. Now, to talk about in a larger sense, with respect to, again, the emphasis on NASEM-compliant digital twins. So virtual humans, personalized computational models, in silico trials, all that stuff is great. All that stuff is what got me interested in doing these types of models 25 years ago. And I do those things too, right? But if you want to do this, then it's a different task because it requires different things. So, first of all, do you need it? Sometimes you may not need something of this degree of component fulfilledness. Let me put it that way. Because if you're focused on surgical planning, right, just as the excellent work from Texas was showing, you don't need to have all that updatable stuff, right? Because you have a particular intervention, then you'll just follow that patient afterwards and see if it needs to happen again, right? But if you have a disease process that requires updatable therapies on a regular basis, well, then you probably need something kind of like this. So one of the things I'm going to say that's controversial is I'm not worried as much about model correctness anymore because of the perpetual epistemic incompleteness of any particular representation, right? The key here is how do you characterize the relevant parameter space given a particular model structure, right? And that representation gives you insight with respect to control and engineering the sensor arrays that you get that you need to provide that ongoing data link. As an example for the kind of irrelevance about the correctness of a model, the fact that people do AI at all, right, to try and do this is an example of a completely huge model in which nothing means anything, right, but you fit to particular data. So a good intermediate step are these physics-informed neural networks. But if people are going to buy using AI or ML, then no one should have any complaint about a highly complex multi-parameter mechanism-based model, because that at least, right, has some knowledge that's embedded in it. This next bullet point is absolutely key. And this is where I think that our particular community needs to make very, very intensive outreach efforts is because we come up with these very complex models that have high degrees of resolution, but it's completely undecided with respect to what those particular states are in a particular clinical setting, right? So we need to be able to reach out to people who are developing non-destructive means of assessing what the molecular state of patients, tissues, organs, or whatever are over time to provide that ongoing data link that's required by the NASEM definition. This is also a pathway to the data matching problem associated with what data you actually collect. Because all of us have run into circumstances where we're trying to fit a particular data set, and the data just isn't the right data that we need for our particular model. If you integrate the way of collecting that data with the model itself to a unified purpose, well, then that's solved. So this is what we've tried to do in our DARPA projects. I can talk about that because this is an immune thing, but we have a wound environment digital twin that was part of a DARPA project that just finished and a new one that's in negotiation phase right now. The bioarchive description is that QR code. But these are systems in which there's a tight integration between the computational representation, agent-based model of volumetric muscle loss, with bioelectric sensors to assess molecular state of that particular wound, and a series of actuatable engineered cells or bacteria to be able to provide input in that kind of semi-closed loop fashion, right? So this is a cyber physical system that's all of that wrapped together. So this is going to be contra to the tendency to want to create standards and modularity. I would argue that what we want or what is needed for medical digital twins to go forward is an application that shows the necessity and the efficacy of the NASEM definition. That's going to require a very tightly engineered virtual representation because it depends upon what the context of use is and the ability to control and actuate in a way that provides that ongoing physical to virtual connection. That's not something you're going to get from a universal model, right? Because that has stuff in it that you don't actually need. So I think that while all those things are great with respect to increasing knowledge and increasing capabilities and stuff like that, in terms of developing actual implementable digital twins, you're going to have to strip those things down a great deal based on that fit for purpose criteria. So thank you very much. Again, acknowledgments to Chase Cockrell, who has done much of this work. This is our funding from the past, and the summary paper in this QR code is for the CIDT. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Gary. That was a great talk. Please put your questions in the Q&A so we can get to them. I guess I have a question. I mean, I actually agree with what you said, but there's also something, I think we sort of already have what you need. A lot of the models already out there, they are based on knowledge. I think you already said it. Mechanistic models have knowledge based. So why is it that we can't leverage some of that knowledge to give you some of the heterogeneity without early on? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I have no supposition that our particular virtual representation is any better than anybody else's virtual representation. I don't, right? It's probably not. Um, but the thing that we do, and this is what keeps us from getting funded at NIH, right? Because we don't want to fit to a mean, right? We don't want to have a restricted set of parameters. We operate over a huge parameter space because what we want to be able to do is encompass human possibility. Because you're never going to know in a particular data set whether or not you have actually collected what the boundary conditions are, what's possible. If and this is why I make a distinction between doing this for control versus doing this for knowledge. Because when you're operating over that uncertainty, you have no idea what's right or wrong. You can just you or actually you have no idea about what's right. What you can say is not wrong, right? It may be wrong, but you can't say it's wrong. But if you encompass that potentially right space in your expansive identification of control space, right? Then doesn't matter because you're accounting for it. So this goes to the idea that it's you want to be able to conserve as much variability in your representation as possible when you're engineering a control strategy.
No, I agree. But I really think that's the essence of what theoretical biology sort of was. When you
It
created
is.
a model, you didn't fit in the constraint of biology. We showed where biology landed in our potential space, right?
Yes, that's right. And I think there's one part of it for understanding, which emphasizes abstraction, trying to identify the principal components and all that kind of stuff, right? But then there's the messiness of the real world where you know that there's stuff that you don't account for, right? These are the infamous unknowable unknowables. How do you actually deal with those? Because those are very real.
Thank you.